I welcome Ajantha Subramanian, Professor of Anthropology and of South Asian Studies and Chair of the Department of Anthropology at Harvard, to the virtual floor to moderate this discussion among the 6 panelists.
Thank you so much, Denise. And thanks to all of you. It was just an incredible, was it just 2 hours? It feels like it was much longer. I mean, it really was a really amazing experience to hear from all of you. And we do have a bunch of questions that have already come in, but I'm also inviting the audience to please submit more. We have a good 25 minutes, I think, for the conversation. So there's a lot that we can address. So please go ahead and submit questions, and I'm going to keep an eye on the Q&A box. Let me start with the questions that have already come in. One of the themes, and this runs across several of the questions, is about visibility and voice. So one of the questions was about how Asian American women might amplify our voices, how we can project our stories to a larger audience, and how we put our work front and center. And a related question was about how curators and editors, the people who sort of mediate the circulation of our work, whether they've had an impact on our ability to tell stories. And there's another interesting question which kind of links to these two, and it's about silence and absence. And the way I read this question was whether there is a virtue to silence and absence. So to put this all together, can you all speak to this call for visibility and voice, which sort of begs the question of who we want to be visible to? Who do we want to hear our stories? Who do we want to be the audience of our accounts? Which spaces do we want to claim? And is there a value in absence and silence? So this is sort of the first set of questions that I'd like us to speak to. So why don't I start with Gina? Do you want to start by addressing this question of audience visibility, voice, silence?
Thank you. And it's an excellent question. It's a question that always comes up. And I will say this about that question for me. My focus is how I'm going to write my narrative in the way that truth occurs to me. And the issue with that is that my truth may be complex, unknown, told in a way that strikes against the common ways, the more conventional ways of doing narrative, because I need to speak the layers of history, the transhistorical, the multiple perspectives that occur in, let's say, the stereo card. And that is not a simple work of art. There's something very simple about it in the sense that all it's asking for the reader is to be attentive and to hear the other and hear oneself as that other speaks. But we understand that the capitalist world of publishing does not exactly work according to truths. They work according to their interests and their designs. And my whole thing about that is I need to just speak my truth and find the ways that, and open myself to those who will publish my work. I cannot and I will not deal with those that expect me to do things any other way. Say, for instance, why do you have 2 wars instead of 1? 2 wars is so confusing. Well, what the, it's not going to happen. So I do need to be very resisting of the concerns of the market, which really saddens my agent. But I think the truth that I need to speak is important to me. So the issue of visibility is not my problem. It is the problem of the public. It is a problem of the society in which we exist, which still refuses and will not immediately or even imagine in the long term dismantling white supremacy.
Thank you, Gina. Do any of the rest of you want to answer that question about visibility? And yeah, Taz.
I'll take a stab. I think one of the things that I want to push back on this question is what's the purpose of having a larger audience? When we created our podcast, it was very popular. We got millions of listens, but we weren't catering to the white people that were listening to our show. Within the first 6 months, we had people that were like, can you please define this term or that term? And we had to take a really specific stand that in the recentering of our conversations with each other, we weren't there to explain to the white gaze. We were there just to explain to each other. And my goal in the podcast was to find that one, young South Asian girl in the middle of the country who didn't have access to anyone like her. So that was the audience I was catering to. And if other people listened along, then that was fine. Like, we weren't like saying this is just for us, but we're saying this is for this person and the rest of you can listen if you want to, but we're not catering our show to the rest of you. We're only catering it to this one person, which is why I want to push back on, there's no, the idea that to have success means you get larger audience or white gazes on your pieces is not really the purpose of telling the unique particular narrative that we need to tell for our communities. And one of the lessons we started realizing in the course of the podcast, by the time we got to like year 2, we were getting a lot of emails from white people that were listening to our podcast, and they say, well, I don't always understand what you're saying, but I'm really enjoying the podcast and I'm Googling, I'm learning. And I think there's something to be said about this idea of allowing other communities to eavesdrop into the conversations we're having and not dumbing our conversations down for that audience. And I know there was another question about how do we build solidarity? That is how you build solidarity with other communities, not dumbing down for this idea of how you're supposed to be, Why not just like have these honest conversations with your community? And if they learn something from the eavesdropping, I don't know, that's a form of solidarity that really made shifts in the work that I've done in how Muslims are perceived in this country. And I think that is definitely one way to do it.
If I could expand on that, because to use the term one struggle, many fronts, to kind of talk about the marketplace, I think that there has to be all kinds of content, all kinds of stories to different audiences. I mean, it's sort of like, in art making, you can make conceptual work that's really vanguard, kind of disrupts the form, but, not a whole lot of people will see it. Or you can make kind of mass market art. And with, as a filmmaker, I mean, I see that in not only in my work, but I'm hearing this ecosystem of, people are doing highly commercial work, and maybe, just somebody who's never met an Asian American will just realize that we're human and we speak English, and sometimes we were born here. I mean, that's all they'll get out of it. And sometimes they'll get our audiences, our target audiences, which are very diverse and very big and broad. And, some, in our audience will have the same kind of consciousness that, a non-Asian would have. So there's just different kinds of stories to be told and people to be reached.
Can I add to that too? I love what Taz said, because I think it's really important, especially in this moment where, as we know, capitalism feeds off the life of people of color, right? They can capitalize on these things for their own intention and only and continue to enforce and reify racial capitalism. So I think it's really important. So not just to be speaking to our people, right? And oftentimes I encounter this with my work. Sometimes, I have works that are not translated, for purposefully, and curators have said, can you translate that? I said, no, that's part of the work. And so I'll pull my work out of the show, and things like that. So I think it's really important to have that integrity, but also understand that there's also those positions, especially as we navigate these institutional relationships. And of course, as we're seeing, we're kind of having this moment, I think, for Asian American culture, right, in the US. And what we have to then navigate are these institutions and hold them to account, right? So it is speaking, having integrity, as Gina said as well, and sort of sticking to what, the integrity of your own work, but also using the power that you have once you start to have this visibility, or once you have relationships with these institutions, to hold them to account. So this even goes as far as like, my collaborator and I just canceled a performance at the MCA Chicago because of some controversies there, and pulling out of a panel recently from some institutions, and sort of dropping a sponsor of a panel from another thing in Canada. So it is about amplifying the conversation by also insisting on the framework around which we speak our stories. So it's not just a matter of inclusion and again, pushing back on the desire to just say we want to belong, we want to just be included. Viet Nguyen just had a really great interview on Between the Covers where he talks about this really eloquently. Whereas, we have to push the conversation where we really challenge again the notion that the myth of the sort of the cohesive nation and what our role is in that. And in fact, that push against a sense of nationalism that's coherent.
I'd love to say a word on absence and silences, because I do feel like I'm like working in a place where, it's very silent, but it's not devoid of language. And I feel like we are trying to wrest back a place in history when we're creating our work. Like that's what I'm feeling from everyone's work, the people who have been erased, neglected, denuded of their resources, incarcerated in camps. And that, the pain of silence in that's something that our work is trying to illuminate. And I think like there's so much of a focus on representation and visibility, which I think is so important in some ways, but in other ways, I think it really turns us into a projection of like something much deeper and truer. When Gina's talking about truth, it's like I am trying to get to the truth in my work, but being kind of mediated by editors in this business that I'm in, like so many people read what I read for you guys today and we're like, this isn't a book. I don't see a book here. And there is a part of us that has to see through white supremacy, patriarchy, like all these systems that are like, you're not real, you're not legible, you're not a story, and still persist despite. And I remember like the deepest moment of silence I had around that is the pain and depression of not being seen, and how being rendered invisible as a Muslim, as a Bangladeshi, as a queer person, all these things forced me to really go inward and get right with my own work. Because I'm like, these people aren't going to get it. What do I think about my work? I'm writing to Taz because Taz is Bengali and Taz understands what I'm talking about. Like getting that specific, even more specific than Asian American. And I think we all connect to our people in our own ways and write to our people in our own ways. But that's where I had to go. I was like, does this resonate for people who share my history? And I think the most beautiful kind of like end to the arc, the painful arc of trying to get a place for this story, is finding a young mixed race editor of color who's femme, who like gets the work and is like of a new generation. And I think that's what we need to keep thinking of, is like, who are we writing our stories for? It's not just the old guard. It's like the people we're leaving our objects and stories behind for, to make them feel more legible. Like all the students that are tuning in to listen to us. I mean, there's just this beautiful like exchange, I feel like, when we really listen to our silence and our pain and our sorrow, and let something beautiful emerge from that place, and don't feel ashamed or embarrassed of it. I feel like there's so much shame for like not winning and not being, you know, on top of your, you know, on top of the game or whatever. I don't know, but it's like those are not very meaningful places for Asian American women and femmes. Like it hasn't really served us. So I'm really just like trying to respect silence and sorrow, and where history has really asked us to listen deeper, because I think that's what our work is all trying to touch.
We have so little time and there's so much to talk about. I want to ask, there are two other questions that I really want us to address. And one is about the sort of the scale of the narrative that we're going for, right? Whose history are we telling? And for most of you, there is this movement between specificity, right? I mean, Tanais, you spoke about it most clearly to say, you know, that there's something hyper specific about the Bangladeshi experience, right? That has to be recovered not just from, you know, the history of empire, but the history of, you know, Indian hegemony, right? So there's a specificity to all of your accounts that come through so beautifully, and they come through through particular objects, right? Which serve as kind of mnemonic devices to get at these histories that often aren't told. But all of you are also talking about histories that are deeply interconnected, right? And they're interconnected, you know, through experiences of empire, of displacement, of marginalization, et cetera. So can you all speak to this relationship between specificity and interconnection in your work? And perhaps also link that to the sort of objects through which you tell these stories, right? These objects that serve as not just mnemonic devices, but serve as ways for you to repurpose them, right? To repurpose these histories, to tell a kind of counter narrative of what we already know. And I'd like to start with Wendy. I wonder if you, because, and I think in part because so many of you spoke about the history of Japanese incarceration, you know, when you presented. So, I mean, Wendy, you know, the story that you're telling is one that is so specific to the Japanese American experience, but it also obviously has this broader resonance for everybody who has been part of this event. So I'd love to start with you and then move to others.
You know, I think this work was mostly, it was really, I made myself do the research because my grandparents and my parents never talked about Executive Order 9066. So really, I'm kind of embarrassed because it wasn't until 2006 that I started reading up about all the camps and attending pilgrimages at different incarceration sites. And, you know, to be honest, I didn't really know very many Japanese Americans like myself, except for family. And so I kind of felt, in many ways, detached from my own community. And I don't know if it's because of the towns where I've grown up, but anyway, this experience was more about reconnecting with my people, so to speak, and to hear their stories. And then through the process of that, I met a lot of Muslim Americans who had just gone through 9/11. They were coming to all of our pilgrimages as well. There's a real bond between the Muslim Americans and Japanese Americans in that the people people who have experienced Executive Order 906 that could really empathize more readily to what was going on with the aftermath of 9/11. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but it more speaks to my reaching out to various communities and also being a disabled Japanese American also has some effect on how I engage with other Asian Americans. So I kind of felt it's just hard, to feel accepted with disability. So, okay, that's it.
I mean, one of the things that really jumped out at me, Wendy, with your presentation was, how you took these tags on the road and you it became this incorporative exercise where there were so many different communities, including high school students and others who may not have ever been told this history, who were brought into it through this object that they were helping to make. So there itself, you see the object acting as a kind of connecting device, right? That crosses borders. Do any of the rest of you want to speak to this question?
As a maker, I can relate to the use of my hands and share that with others with a singular goal. It was just very, it was very unifying to some degree. So, I think, and then also objects that are tactile. And so the whole process of making these tags was all about touching and writing and reading and feeling. So that's kind of important to me.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to speak to this question?
I'd like to
specificity.
I think that one of the things, Ajanta, you were asking is so interesting because there's this idea of specificity, but it's also like what I'm exploring right now and learning right now is that things have been integrally interconnected, and part of the capitalist colonial project was erasing those interconnections for a sort of exploitative gain. So like, I'll take an example of turmeric, which actually comes from what is now called Vietnam in Southeast Asia, but is like one of the most iconic ingredients in India and has become hegemonized as an Indian thing, but it actually doesn't come from India. It comes from what we now call Vietnam. So I think in really going into material culture or objects, or as Wendy, took the tag and created community around that, I think that's part of our job, is really destabilizing this idea of what is, high culture, if it's literature or film or whatever, like that, that's not where these interconnected histories are. The wealth of Bengal once contributed to building India and Pakistan, and there was this like extensive trade that really shaped Indian history. But you won't hear about Bangladeshi women who made Indian history. We're actually not studied in India as a part of Indian history. We have Bangladeshi history, but that's a saying that our history started in 1971, which is absolutely ridiculous. So these notions of like time and nation and borders, those are all falsehoods that we are kind of, we're pushing against those boundaries to wrest back the connections that we have. Like I even have a Yuri Kochiyama story. I visited Yuri Kochiyama when I was 21 in her home where she was staying at the end of her life. And I interviewed her for my school thesis project. Like you, Renee, that dictaphone recording is like in my parents' house, like not in great shape. I wish I had transcribed it and digitized it, but I didn't because I was 21 and like didn't know like the greatness I was sitting among. But talking to her, we're both Asian American. I'm Muslim. She knew Malcolm X. That was the first autobiography I read to make sense of being a Muslim South Asian person in America, because Black Muslims were the first people who were Muslim on this land. So we're always in conversation in ways that are kind of pushing against these very specific histories that we've inherited. Like that idea itself to me feels like a falsehood that I'm trying to fight, with my art, where it's like Black history is the history of this land. It's not just like a thing to celebrate in 1 month. It is connected to Asian history. It has allowed us to be here. Black people have allowed us to be here. Native people have allowed us to be. Their histories have allowed us to have what we have here in this conversation today. So I don't know. I think like seeing the images of all those people making the tags, like it is so moving because it is an acknowledgement that what these Japanese people went through as their homeland was at war with this land. Everyone is acknowledging that that's a part of their history, and that's very powerful.
You're out of time, but
Oh.
I do want, if it's okay, I'd really like whoever wants to respond to this question to do so before we pass it on.
I wanted to respond to, it was a big question, but so as a filmmaker, really, I think this question of specificity versus, or looking at the big picture, it's the specificity is almost a tactical decision. It's like, how do you get across like these, huge themes and these interconnections in a way that's digestible for the audience? And when you tell the Asian American story, it's like quite often a story that, people don't have a baseline of knowledge. So when we did the docuseries Asian Americans, you can imagine, country music got 13 hours. One white guy, Ernest Hemingway, is just about to get 6 hours. We got 5 hours to tell 170 years of all the breadth of Asian American history. So how do you do that? You really, for the audience, we chose to really look at these personal kinds of stories in order to kind of infiltrate it with these, the framing we had was, how empire shaped the Asian American story, systemic racism, why, after Reconstruction, Jim Crow and anti-Asian exclusion emerged, in parallel to each other, these kinds of the racial hierarchy, how that was built. And you ask about gatekeepers, the PBS suits really pushed back. This idea of the model minority is just so ubiquitous. They thought, why are you talking about these things? This is so harsh. And, we'd say, are you kidding me? This is anti-Asian exclusion, Jim Crow, colonialization, people couldn't be naturalized. The Chinese Exclusion Act, you think we have to put like lipstick on this pig? No way you can do that. But they just couldn't imagine the Asian American, in the space of struggle and contention. And that was a real fight. But our stories win. If we had aired in May of 2020 some like model minority series, about the great adventures of Asian America in May of 2020, in this time of, the fall of democracy in this pandemic of hate and disease, we would have been laughed out of the airwaves. But in that sense, however we constructed, whatever strategies we take, I think we have to self-determine our own story. We have to tell our own story. And that's an assumption that we can't always make because of the gatekeepers.
Oh, I really wish we could keep going. And I wish, we were all in the same place so we could go out together. But unfortunately, we have to call this to a close. So thank you all so much for your incredible work across so many genres. And just the sort of inspiration that you all provide. I'm going to now pass the floor to Helen Zia for concluding remarks. Helen Zia, who is the author of Last Boat Out of Shanghai, the epic story of the Chinese who fled Mao's revolution. She's also a former journalist and former executive editor of Miss Magazine. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ajanta. And I do have the difficult task of offering some closing remarks to this amazing event. My heart is so full after hearing these inspiring wise women. And I think you'll all agree that our speakers were so generous with their insightful, provocative, personal, intimate stories. I'd like to thank all of the remarkable panelists for illuminating the depth and breadth of the multi-generational, multi-dimensional, transnational lived experiences that go right to the heart and soul of our beloved communities. And so I wanted to just share a few reflections that these presentations brought up for me about telling the truths of our communities. I have called what I think is where we, in our place of invisibility, have been MIH, missing in history. And I came up with this thought that we were not just MIA, we're MIH, because I have always enjoyed going to museums, especially local museums that exist in small towns. And many of these places celebrate the master narrative of America, you know, the Pilgrims, the Cowboys, the whiteness of America, that does not acknowledge the genocide of indigenous people or the enslavement of people from Africa or the xenophobia towards people who are not white. And so I just wanted to, what came to mind were two places that I've been, and that is Sandwich, Massachusetts, and Virginia City, Nevada. And in both of those very small, you know, towns and the small museums that exist in them, I found a couple of displays that had artifacts from China that were clearly created by Chinese people. And so Sandwich, Massachusetts is the oldest town in Cape Cod. It is the home of many sea captains, especially from the clipper ship days. And of course, they were going to China. And Virginia City was a mining town in the Rocky Mountains of the Old West. And so these towns today, or when I went to them, were largely white. I often felt like I was the only Asian person, you know, to walk in their doors. And what was this stuff, Chinese stuff, doing there? How did they get there? Why were they there? There were no explanations. They were just there. And it occurred to me that if stuff from China came, it's likely that people from China came too. The things were valuable. The things were worth preserving. But what about the people? The people were expendable. They were detritus to be disposed of, including their stories. And so I thought they were lost to history, MIH, missing in history. And then there was my visit to the Alaska State Museum in Ketchikan, Alaska. I was there because I was doing research about the Filipino-American migrant workers in the Alaskan canneries, the fishing canneries. And there were different waves of Asian American immigrant workers that included Chinese, Korean, as well as Filipino American workers. And as I walked through that museum, I wondered, would I find any trace of those people who I knew had not only inhabited Alaska, but helped build it? And I found nothing until I saw a single photo on a wall. And that was about a machine that had been invented in 1903 that could clean and gut salmon, cut their heads off and tails off and have them prepared for the canning industry. And on the wall of this picture of the machine was the caption, iron chink, nothing else, no context, no explanation that this was a racial slur. It was so named by the inventor because the machine was so rapid it could do the work of 10 Chinese workers, and in a backhanded way might have been a compliment to the efficiency and productivity of these Chinese who were there. And I thought about all of the school children and the tourists off of cruise ships and people from all over the world who would visit this museum. And so I asked to speak to somebody in authority who I then after waiting a while, got to meet and who just looked at me as though I were somebody from Mars, and just got a kind of a polite, well, what's the big deal? So when I got home, I wrote a letter to explain what the big deal was and that this photo needed some context. It needed to explain at a minimum that this was a racial slur today. So I waited a month, and then 2 months, and then 6 months, and a year went by, and there was no response, and I forgot about it. And then more than a year later, I got a letter. It was from Alaska. It was from a curator at the museum who was so apologetic, said that they never would intentionally have a racial slur at their museum, and therefore they were removing the photo. So there was that unintended consequence. The photo, the only exhibit there that acknowledged the existence of Asian people in sort of a way, was removed. So now Asian Americans were MIH completely in Alaska's State Museum. Now that was 20 years ago, so maybe it's changed today. But I want to say that in many ways, archives are similar to museums, right? They are vaults of objects that document the lived lives of our communities. And choices have to be made. Whose lives are worth remembering? Whose lives are worth giving space for holdings, worth investing in classifying, digitizing, maintaining, storing, making them available? Archives require a lot of very skilled people and resources of every kind. And so whose archives and stories are worth keeping and devoted resources to? So I did want to say that the Harvard Radcliffe Schlesinger archives will be the home for those Alaska letters and much more of mine. And I want to say this because I've spent a lot of time wondering where to put my stuff. And I've been often reminded by my wife, who has said more than a few times, if you get hit by a truck, what am I going to do with all of this bleep? And so I am sending my stacks of boxes to the Schlesinger archives because they are committed to creating a space for Asian American women's stories as illustrated by this event and all the work that has gone behind creating Asian American women's collections. And the Schlesinger archives are also going to get things from my mother. And there's not a lot because my mom was an abandoned girl. She was abandoned not once, but twice as a child in wartime China. And then she fled China because of the impending revolution. But my mother had an amazing memory. And for my last book, I spent hundreds of hours interviewing my mom. And after she passed away in 2017, just before I was completing the manuscript of my book that was inspired by her stories, I still found things that were a complete surprise and shock. So before I close, I thought I'd share a few of those things. And if we could have the photos, please. So this is my mom on the left with me as a baby. And on the right is my mom as she grew older and not long before she passed. And in the middle here is a little notebook, the kind of notebook you'll find at a supermarket or a drugstore or Kmart. And my mother had a bunch of these notebooks. Next slide, please. And so these are just a few of the notebooks. On the far left with 1993 and Helen, my mother, as the daughter of immigrants, a family of immigrants, you know, we kids were my parents' pension plan. We were their security. And so as soon as any of us made any money, no matter how small it was, we started sending money home. And lo and behold, my mother kept a little register of all of the money that for each of us, there are 6 kids and there are sections in these notebooks. We had no idea. And after my mother passed away, my siblings and I sat around kind of looking at these books and going, oh, okay. And none of us, I have to say, including myself, who I have these books, are going to go through and add any of them up. But it's something my mother kept. And then there are these journals. in Chinese. I had no idea my mother kept journals for years. I can't read them because they're in Chinese. And I'm a little afraid to get them translated because the book page that I have open has my name on it, and various pages have different ones of us and different things in them, that are pop up in English. And I'm afraid of what my mother might have said about me if I had done something bad or upset her in some way, but there they are. And so next slide, please. There are many of these little notebooks that show how my mother, who didn't get a formal education past the 3rd grade, had stacks and stacks of books where she practiced her English, where she went through vocabulary, and each word in English is written in her very careful handwriting that reminds me of so many handwritings of people whose first language is not English. It's so careful and deliberate and actually beautiful. And some are misspelled. And I've kind of leafed through them to see the kind of words that she thought were important to keep. Yeah, you can see them yourself. Some are very grateful: hospital, emergency, drugstores, hurt, crazy, poison. What do they mean? Why did she choose these words? And the one on the right, I recognize some of these things. My mother, she kept Hallmark cards in business. She would write cards and she would, in her careful handwriting, have the signatures with a message in there. And these are some of the messages she saved. Next slide, please. And so what did these mean? On the lined portion, this must have been when my mother lived in New York or would be going to New York and would say, take the downtown local to Chinatown. That was something she wrote, and some subway words. But if you look at the page above, she's got gullet, soil, anus, urine, pass urine, semen, penis, vagina, womb. And then on the other side, happy Halloween. I don't know what these words mean. I don't know what my mother was thinking when she wrote them. What is the context? So I bring these forward because I want to say we all have things that we have found from dear ones, loved ones, and we have to ask when it's too late to ask them, what meaning can we draw from the things that our beloved communities leave behind? I don't know what my mother intended, but clearly these were significant enough for her to keep them. And so I'd like to end with the thought that if we safeguard the stories we tell and the objects we find, then future researchers, future generations can find the significance as well, and that our communities will not be invisible or MIH. So my thanks to all of you. Thank you to our panelists for their very thoughtful perspectives and for our audience for the terrific questions. My thanks to all at the Schlesinger Archives for all your efforts to make sure that Asian American women's voices will not go missing in history. As Dean Tamiko Brown-Niggin said, our history and archives must reflect we the people, so that our communities' stories will be preserved and shared and told for generations to come. And that concludes our program today. The program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information on upcoming Radcliffe virtual programs and to see the videos of past events, please visit www.radcliffe.harvard.edu. So thank you all again for joining us today, and please take care. Thank you.